Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. Today is going to be a heavy one because usually we're looking at things that feel a bit distant, right? Like tech giants or abstract economics. But today we are looking at something that is intimately, physically part of you.
Yeah, you likely interacted with this system 3 times today, maybe 4 if you had a snack before listening to this.
Exactly. And yet, despite how close we are to it, literally putting it inside our bodies, we almost never see the actual machinery behind it. We see the product, we taste the flavor, but the infrastructure is completely invisible. We are talking about the industrial food system.
Right.
And I have to say, diving into the source material for today's deep dive, specifically Food Matters by Mark Bittman, I realized I've basically been walking through the grocery store with a blindfold on for my entire adult life.
Which is exactly the goal of this deep dive. We are conducting a systems-level institutional analysis today. I want to be clear, we aren't doing a book review here.
No, definitely not.
And this certainly isn't a cooking segment. We're looking at the architecture of modern eating. We want to understand how a single calorie travels from a policy decision in Washington, D.C. to a field in Iowa, through a factory, and eventually onto your plate.
And our guide for this, as I mentioned, is Food Matters.
Okay.
Now, most people know Mark Bittman as a food journalist, right? The gourmand, the guy who taught America how to cook everything. But in this text, he really steps out of the kitchen and into the role of a systems analyst.
He does. He's using food as an entry point into agricultural policy, energy economics, and climate impact. Because the core premise we need to start with is this: identity equals systems. What we eat isn't just a personal choice or some pure reflection of our taste. It is the output of a designed industrial engine.
And that brings us to the whole concept of our show today, the crisis in perception.
Exactly. That's our analytical lens. Generally, when we talk about food, we use the language of the individual, right? We talk about willpower or cravings or tradition. The crisis in perception is that we fail to see food as a product of energy markets, government subsidies, and corporate design. We think we're choosing a burger because we want a burger.
But the reality is that the system has spent billions of dollars ensuring that the burger is the cheapest, most available, and most marketed option sitting right in front of us. It's like a magician forcing a card. You think you picked the ace of spades, but it was basically the only card in the deck.
Precisely. And to understand how the deck was stacked, we really have to look at the design, because the way we eat now, this whole industrial model, is actually a very, very recent experiment in human history.
It feels permanent, but it's really just a blip. So let's establish the baseline here. If we go back to the year 1900, the landscape of American food looked fundamentally different.
Completely different. In 1900, 41% of Americans worked in agriculture.
Which is almost half the workforce.
Nearly half. If you didn't live on a farm yourself, you absolutely knew someone who did. You probably bought your food from the person who actually grew it. Today, that number is less than 2%. We have effectively depopulated the American countryside and consolidated food production into a tiny, tiny fraction of the population.
That is a staggering drop. I mean, it basically means we went from a society where almost everyone had a hand in the biological process of survival to a society where food
It just appears.
Right, it's magic. It's just on the shelf in plastic.
And that shift from the family farm model to the factory farm model isn't just nostalgia, it's a fundamental shift in energy physics. This is crucial to understand. The traditional farm was solar powered.
Okay, explain that, because obviously they don't have solar panels bolted to barns in 1900.
No, I mean biologically solar. You grew crops, grasses, grains that captured energy directly from the sun. You fed those crops to animals. The animals then provided manure, which is nitrogen, to fertilize the soil for the next crop. It was a closed loop, a biological cycle where the primary energy input was the sun.
And the modern factory farm?
It is fossil fuel powered and strictly linear. It's an extraction model now. We don't rely on the sun and manure anymore. We rely on synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and heavy machinery. And all those are derived from or powered by oil and natural gas. We bring in inputs like fuel and chemistry, and we ship out units of production.
And those units of production are living things. But the system just treats them like widgets on an assembly line.
That is the critical design choice right there. The industrial logic treats animals and crops not as living organisms with biological needs, but as components. The goal of this system is pure efficiency and volume. It is completely unrelated to nutritional density or environmental sustainability. If you can grow more corn per acre by killing the soil life with heavy chemicals, the industrial logic says do it, because the metric of success is yield, not health.
You mentioned corn, and we really cannot talk about the American food system without talking about corn and soy. Going through the research, it just seems like everything leads back to those two plants.
They are the hardware of the entire system. If you look at the total U.S. harvest, corn and soybeans account for 50% of it. Half of everything we grow in this massive country is just two species of plant.
Why? Is it just because Americans love corn on the cob that much?
Not at all. We actually eat very little of it directly as corn. We grow it because corn is an incredibly efficient biological machine. It's a C4 grass, meaning it captures sunlight and turns it into calories faster than almost anything else. If your goal is to create raw biomass, just sheer tonnage of carbohydrates, corn is the undisputed winner.
But growing the exact same thing over and over again, doesn't that defy basic biology? I remember learning about crop rotation in grade school.
Right, in a healthy biological system, you need diversity. You rotate crops. One year, you plant corn, which is a really hungry plant that sucks nitrogen out of the soil. The next year, you plant legumes, like beans, which pull nitrogen from the air and put it back into the soil. They heal the land. But in the industrial design, that's seen as inefficient because beans don't make as much money as corn. So we stripped away the rotation entirely. We plant corn, then corn, then corn.
Which creates a monoculture.
A vast, fragile monoculture. And since the soil is essentially dead because the corn ate all the nutrients, you have to inject life back into it artificially. You have to truck in synthetic nitrogen fertilizer.
Which, again, goes back to fossil fuels.
Specifically natural gas. The Haber-Bosch process turns natural gas into nitrogen fertilizer. So when you look at a sprawling field of corn in Iowa, you are literally looking at a field of natural gas that has been processed into food. That is the actual thermodynamics of it.
And this design choice, prioritizing commodity consistency over ecological health, is exactly what enables the factory farm. Because you can't have a confined animal feeding operation or a CAFO without that artificially cheap corn and soy.
Exactly. Bittman describes these places as a living hell. And frankly, the descriptions are hard to read. We were talking about billions of animals here.
The stat in the book is 10 billion animals killed annually in the U.S. alone. That number is so big it almost loses all meaning.
But here is the structural observation we have to make. That density is only possible because the feed is artificially cheap and transportable. If you had to graze those cows on grass, you'd need half the continent. You can't stack 50,000 cows in a feedlot if they have to eat grass. But if you can bring the processed corn to the cow, you can stack them. The design of the farm is entirely dictated by the availability of the input.
So the corn basically enables the crowding.
The corn enables the crowding, and then heavy doses of antibiotics enable the survival of the animals in those crowded conditions. It's a highly precarious system held together by chemistry.
Okay, so we have this biological machine, the factory farm, that demands massive amounts of corn to function. But here's the obvious question. Why would a farmer choose to grow only corn if it destroys their soil? I mean, they aren't villains, they're business people. They want their farm to survive for their grandkids. So who is signing the checks that make this the only viable option?
This brings us perfectly to the incentives, the economic engine. And this is where we really have to talk about government policy.
I think this is where the crisis in perception really hit home for me. We stand in the grocery store and see a fast food burger for $1 and a fresh salad for $6. And we naturally think, well, the market has spoken. Meat is just cheap to produce.
But that is the cheap food illusion. It is not the free market. If you take one thing away from this deep dive, let it be this. The American food supply is a highly constructed market driven by heavy government intervention.
So let's trace this back. Bittman points to the 1970s as the major pivot point.
Specifically the Nixon administration.
Right. So context for everyone listening, it's the early 70s. Inflation is rising across the board. But specifically, food prices spiked. There was a massive grain deal with the Soviet Union, bad weather in the Midwest. Suddenly, the price of beef and bread skyrocketed. People were literally protesting in the streets. Housewives were organizing boycotts of supermarkets.
And Nixon was, above all, politician. He was terrified of the political fallout. There's an old geopolitical saying that every society is only 3 missed meals away from revolution. Nixon knew that. He basically told his cabinet this cannot happen again. Food prices must come down, and they must stay down permanently.
Enter Earl Butz.
Earl Butz, Secretary of Agriculture. He is probably the most influential person in the history of what you eat, even if you've never heard his name before. He was a brilliant, incredibly brash economist from Indiana. And he had a very specific vision.
He's the guy who gave us the mantra, get big or get out.
And plant fence row to fence row. Before buts, the U.S. agricultural policy, dating way back to the Great Depression, was about supporting farmers by managing supply. It functioned like a dam. If there was too much corn, the government paid farmers to store it, or even to leave land fallow. The goal was to keep prices high enough so farmers wouldn't go bankrupt.
So the government actually acted as a brake on production.
Correct. Butts flipped that entirely on its head.
Oh.
He removed the brakes. He moved from supporting the farmer to subsidizing overproduction. He dismantled the supply controls and replaced them with a brand new subsidy structure.
Explain the mechanism there, because subsidy is a word we hear a lot but rarely actually unpack. How does it work for the farmer sitting in the tractor?
The mechanism has changed over time, but the core logic introduced in that era was the deficiency payment, or the non-recourse loan. Essentially, the government sets a target price for commodity corn. Let's say, theoretically, it's $3 a bushel. If farmer grows a massive amount of corn and floods the market price might drop to $2. In a normal free market, the farmer would lose money and naturally stop growing so much next year.
Right, basic supply and demand.
But under the butt system, the government steps in and writes the farmer a check for the difference. They pay that extra dollar directly. So if I'm a farmer, the message I'm getting is, it doesn't matter if anyone actually wants to buy this corn. It doesn't matter if the market price crashes to zero, the government will pay me to grow it. In fact, the absolute only way to make more money is to grow more bushels.
So sheer volume becomes the only metric that matters.
Exactly. You are heavily incentivized to ignore market demand and focus purely on yield. This created the massive subsidy feedback loop. Farmers bought bigger tractors, used more synthetic fertilizer, and bought out their neighbors to get more land. Literally, get big or get out, just to harvest those government checks.
And the numbers are staggering when you look at them. Subsidies cost taxpayers roughly $19 billion a year. But here is the kicker from the data. That money doesn't go to the small family farmer struggling to get by with a few chickens and a vegetable plot.
No. The vast majority of that money benefits the absolute largest commodity growers. It benefits about 3,100 large corporate operations. It massively accelerates consolidation, but connects us back to the consumer. We actually pay for our food twice.
Once at the grocery store.
And once on April 15th when we pay our taxes to subsidize the commodity corn that makes the fast food burger cheap. The burger isn't actually $1. It costs $1 at the register because you already paid the other $2 to the IRS to keep the corn cheap for the feedlot.
That is just, it's infuriating. But it explains perfectly why the salad is expensive. There are no massive government subsidies for broccoli.
Very few. Specialty crops, as they are called in the legislation, which is fruits and vegetables, are largely left to fend for themselves in the free market. Commodity crops, corn, soy, wheat, rice, cotton, are completely backed by the federal treasury.
So Earl Butt says grow more, farmers grow more, and suddenly we have mountains of corn, a literal river of corn. We physically could not eat it all as a nation. We had a massive surplus problem.
A historic surplus problem. And a system, much like a living organism, wants to survive. You can't just burn the corn. Well, actually, we'll get to that. But the industrial food system had to invent ways to consume the surplus it had artificially created. This is where the corporate food scientists come in.
This is the exact moment where food stops being food and starts being what Bittman calls refined biomass.
Invention number 1, high fructose corn syrup. In the late 70s and early 80s, the Japanese developed a commercial process to break down cornstarch into a highly concentrated sweetener. It was liquid, it was incredibly shelf-stable, and thanks to Earl Butts, it was dirt cheap. Much, much cheaper than importing sugarcane.
And suddenly, it's in absolutely everything. It's in bread to keep it soft, it's in ketchup, it's in salad dressing, and obviously, it's the foundation of soda.
It made empty calories cheap and ubiquitous. It allowed beverage companies to exponentially increase serving sizes without really increasing their costs. The supersized meal is basically just an economic expression of cheap corn syrup.
Then there is invention number 2, cheap animal feed.
Right. We had so much corn, we started feeding it to animals that aren't even biologically evolved to eat it. Cows are ruminants, they eat grass. Their stomachs are delicately pH balanced for the slow fermentation of forage. When you feed them starchy corn, they get sick, they get acidosis. But corn fattens them up incredibly quickly.
So the surplus corn essentially allowed us to scale up meat production to levels that were previously biologically impossible.
Exactly. And invention number 3 is ethanol. We are now burning roughly 40% of the entire U.S. corn crop in our cars. We legislated that gasoline must contain ethanol, largely just to prop up the price of corn and use up the endless surplus.
There's a quote here that really stuck with me from the analysis. Overproduction drives overconsumption. We didn't collectively demand 32-ounce sodas. The system had too much corn syrup and structurally needed us to drink 32-ounce sodas to clear the inventory.
That's a perfect way to phrase it. Demand didn't drive supply. Supply engineered the demand. The human stomach basically became the waste disposal unit for the agricultural surplus.
So we have the design, the factory farm, and the incentives, the subsidies. Now let's look at the outcomes. What does this massive machine actually produce?
Well, the first major outcome is a thermodynamic disaster. We talked earlier about how the old farm was solar-powered, the new farm is oil-powered, but the conversion ratio is terrifying.
The solar versus oil equation. Bittman notes that it takes 40 calories of fossil fuel energy to produce just 1 calorie of beef protein.
Think about that efficiency ratio, 40 to 1. If you ran a business where you consistently spent $40 to make $1, you would be bankrupt in an hour. But because of those subsidies and the externalized costs, this system persists. We are essentially eating oil. We are taking a finite, non-renewable resource, processing it through a cow, and eating the result.
There are two specific details in the source material that made my jaw drop regarding this energy inefficiency. First, the diet soda. A 12-ounce diet soda contains exactly 1 calorie.
Right. It provides no biological energy.
But it takes 2,200 calories of fossil fuel energy to produce it, mostly to mine the bauxite, smelt the aluminum for the can, process the water, chill it, and truck it across the country. 2,200 to 1. That feels like a glitch in the simulation.
It is the definition of insanity from a systems perspective. We are burning the planet to create a vessel for zero nutrition.
And the second step. A half-gallon plastic milk jug takes 2,100 calories just to manufacture the plastic.
We are literally expending ancient sunlight fossil fuels to create single-use packaging for empty calories. And this massive energy inefficiency bleeds directly into the second predictable outcome, public health.
This is where we have to talk about globicity.
The World Health Organization stats cited in Food Matters are haunting. Roughly 1 billion people in the world are chronically hungry, and roughly 1 billion are overweight or obese.
That is a perfect, incredibly tragic balance.
And it is a direct, measurable result of the Earl Butz era. Since 1970, daily calorie consumption in the U.S. is up about 25%. That's roughly 500 extra calories a day per person. We are actively being force-fed by the commodity surplus.
I want to touch on the low-fat era here because this is another piece of the puzzle that confused me for years. In the 70s, we had the McGovern Committee. They looked at the rising heart disease rates and wanted to tell Americans quite simply, eat less meat. That seems straightforward enough.
It was straightforward science, but it was absolute political suicide. George McGovern chaired the Senate committee. They released a draft report saying exactly that. Eat less meat. The cattle and dairy lobbies went nuclear. They organized instantly. They threatened to pull funding from agricultural state senators. They made it abundantly clear that if McGovern wanted to stay in office, he could not tell Americans to stop buying their product.
So what happened to the guidelines?
They forced a change in the language. And this is a masterclass in corporate obfuscation. Instead of eat less meat, the guidelines officially became eat less saturated fat.
Which sounds to the average person like the same thing, but it's definitely not.
It is a world of difference. Eat less meat is a clear, actionable instruction about a whole food you buy at the store. Eat less saturated fat is a chemical abstraction. You can't see saturated fat. And crucially, it gave the highly processed food industry a massive loophole. They said, okay, we will take the fat out of our products.
And they replaced it with the surplus, sugar and refined carbs.
The Snackwells phenomenon. We had cookies that were marketed as fat-free, but were absolutely loaded with high fructose corn syrup to make them palatable. People ate the whole box thinking they were being virtuous. They thought, it's healthy, it's fat-free.
And everyone got bigger and sicker as a result.
Right? Because the system successfully replaced a satiating macronutrient fat with a highly addictive one-sugar oil derived from that exact same subsidized corn surplus. We demonized a whole food and replaced it with a processed fraction.
The third major outcome here is environmental degradation. And this brings us to the Livestock's Long Shadow Report.
This was a landmark report published by the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. It found that livestock production is responsible for about 1/5 of all global greenhouse gases.
That is more than the entire transportation sector. Cars, planes, trains, cargo ships combined.
And this is exactly where we use the crisis in perception analytically again. When we think about climate change, we agonize over the choice between buying a Prius and an SUV. We perceive that as the ultimate climate choice.
But we completely fail to perceive the choice between ordering the burger and the salad as a climate choice.
Even though the data strongly suggests the dietary choice might be far more significant over a lifetime, the system intentionally hides the carbon footprint of the diet. You see a pristine styrofoam package in the meat aisle. You don't see the methane, the nitrous oxide, and the massive deforestation required to actually fill it.
Okay, so let's recap where we are. The system is thermodynamically incredibly inefficient, it's demonstrably making us sick, and it's heating up the planet. Logic would dictate that we immediately change it. If a car model had no brakes and slowly poisoned its passengers, we would recall it. But we aren't recalling the food system. Why? This brings us to the persistence. How does the system actively protect itself?
It protects itself through immense structural marketing. And I don't just mean a few television commercials. I mean the very architecture of consumer desire. Big food meets big ad.
We have to talk about the checkoff programs here, because until I read the source material, I genuinely thought Got Milk was just a really clever ad agency campaign. I had no idea this was how it actually worked.
Most people don't. It sounds a bit like a conspiracy theory, but it's just dry federal legislation. A checkoff program is a mandatory tax on agricultural producers. Every time a rancher sells a head of cattle, a sliver of that money, say $1 a head, goes directly into a federal fund.
And that federal fund is used for what?
Generic advertising. This is exactly where Got Milk came from. This is pork, the other white meat. This is beef. It's what's for dinner.
Wait, pause for a second. So these aren't just private companies advertising their specific brand of milk or beef. This is a government-sanctioned program.
Yes. The USDA directly oversees the collection of these funds to market the surplus. It is government-sanctioned propaganda designed to artificially increase demand for overproduced commodities. In fact, there was a major Supreme Court case about this Johans v. Livestock Marketing Association. Some farmers didn't want to pay the tax for the ads because they disagreed with the generic message. The Supreme Court ruled that the ads legally constitute government speech.
So the federal government is legally mandated to convince me to eat more beef.
Yes. While the Department of Health is over here telling you to eat less red meat for your heart, the Department of Agriculture is spending millions of dollars to tell you to eat more of it for dinner. It is a completely schizophrenic government policy.
So when I see those iconic ads, I'm literally seeing the system trying to clear its inventory.
Exactly. And it goes so much deeper than TV ads. It's built into the physical space of the grocery store itself. We have the illusion of choice.
You walk down the cereal aisle, and there are 200 brightly colored options. It feels like infinite variety. Captain Crunch, Fruit Loops, Corn Flakes.
But flip any of those boxes over. Read the ingredients panel. It's corn, soy, wheat, sugar. Just rearranged, heavily processed, and dyed different colors. It is the exact same 4 subsidized ingredients extruded into different shapes. And the placement of those boxes isn't accidental either. We have to look at slotting fees.
This is basically real estate rent for shelf space, right?
Huge amounts of rent. Corporate food companies pay supermarkets for the end caps, those highly visible displays at the end of the aisle. They pay premium rates for the eye-level shelves. The market isn't neutral at all. The most profitable foods, which are always the processed corn and soy derivatives, have the highest marketing budgets. They literally crowd out whole foods. You often have to physically bend down to the bottom shelf to find the plain oats or the dried beans because the profit margins on raw agricultural products are too low to pay the rent for the top shelf.
And they're getting to us early, too. There was a specific study mentioned in the source material about children and McDonald's branding that was, well, it was chilling.
This one is devastating from a behavioral standpoint. Researchers gave young children 2 sets of carrots and milk, identical unseasoned food. In one group, the packaging was completely plain. In the other, it was wrapped in bright McDonald's branding. They simply asked the kids which one tasted better. The children statistically preferred the taste of the carrots and milk if they thought they came from McDonald's.
They tasted the brand, not the actual food.
This demonstrates perfectly how corporate branding overrides human sensory perception. The system colonizes the identity of the consumer starting from childhood. You aren't just eating, you are participating in a manufactured ritual. You are consuming happiness or fun, not just calories.
And when we do actively try to eat healthy as adults, the system deliberately confuses us with nutritionism.
This is a vital concept popularized by researchers like Georgi Skrinis and Michael Pollan. Nutritionism is the societal obsession with invisible nutrients, omega-3s, fiber, antioxidants, rather than actual whole food.
It's why you see a giant heart-healthy banner on a box of highly sugared cereal just because it happens to have low fat.
Fiber.
Or now with vitamin D printed on a bottle of soda.
Or good source of fiber on a chocolate chip cookie. This framework benefits the industrial food system immensely. If health is reduced to just a checklist of microscopic ingredients, they can just enrich highly processed junk with synthetic vitamins and confidently slap a health claim on the box. It allows them to engineer the illusion of health into a product that is fundamentally biologically unhealthy.
It's the ultimate gaslight.
As Pollan famously says, a health claim on a food product is a very good indication that it's not really food. A fresh apple doesn't have a plastic wrapper saying, "now with more fiber." It's just an apple. Silence is the mark of real food. Noise, claims, and branding are the marks of an industrial product.
So we have seen the design, the economic incentives, the biological outcomes, and the marketing machine that keeps it all spinning. But this doesn't exist in a vacuum. The food system is nested inside other massive global systems, interconnection.
You absolutely cannot separate food from energy markets. We touched on this with the thermodynamics, but the food system accounts for roughly 10% of all fossil fuel use in the U.S. If you are a policymaker worried about energy independence, you have to look at the Farm Bill. We are literally eating the strategic oil reserve.
And it connects deeply to global trade.
The American appetite directly drives global land use changes. Our intense demand for cheap beef and cheap soy drives aggressive deforestation in the Amazon basin. We are exporting our ecological footprint. When you buy cheap beef at the drive-thru, you are often buying a piece of the rainforest that was burned down to graze cattle or grow soy for export markets.
But the connection that probably hits the domestic wallet the hardest is healthcare financing.
This is the most tragic feedback loop in the entire analysis. We have a national policy that heavily subsidizes the mass production of disease via cheap corn syrup and factory-farmed meat, and an economy that heavily profits from the lifelong treatment of that very disease.
The rise in type 2 diabetes, chronic heart disease, stroke, these all correlate perfectly with the massive shift to the industrial diet in the 70s.
And look closely at the pharmaceutical industry. The blockbuster drugs, the ones that make billions of dollars year after year, are almost all for managing lifestyle diseases. Statins for high cholesterol, synthetic insulin for diabetes, beta blockers for high blood pressure.
We are paying our tax dollars to make the toxic food artificially cheap, and then paying massive insurance premiums to treat the damage that food inevitably caused.
It is a closed-loop system that essentially creates its own perpetual customers on both ends. Big food breaks your metabolism, big pharma manages the symptoms, and you pay for both indefinitely.
So looking at this entire machine, from the Farm Bill to the checkoff programs to the hospital waiting room, what is the crisis in perception here?
It ultimately comes down to three specific, deeply ingrained misperceptions that keep us trapped in this cycle.
Break them down for us.
First, the myth of cheap. We perceive industrial food as cheap solely because the register price is low. But that price is a structural lie. The true costs are just externalized. We pay them in taxes for the agricultural subsidies. We pay them in environmental degradation, which hits us downstream as climate change and extreme weather. And we pay them in exploding future healthcare costs. If the price of a fast food burger actually reflected its true cost to society, including the carbon emissions, the water depletion, and the medical care, it would be $30.
That certainly puts the dollar menu in perspective. It's basically a loan shark loan taken out against our own bodies.
Second is the myth of willpower. We deeply perceive obesity and diet as personal moral failures. We look at someone who is struggling with their weight and think they just need some self-control. In reality, individuals are fighting a multi-billion-dollar engineered environment deliberately designed to trigger ancient biological cravings for salt, sugar, and fat. You cannot willpower your way out of a corporate biochemistry lab that has been explicitly weaponized against your survival instincts. The bliss point in these foods is carefully engineered by teams of scientists.
That is a massive relief, in a way. It's not just us being individually weak, it's the opponent being incredibly structurally strong.
And third, the visibility crisis. We see the modern supermarket as a place of infinite abundance. Look at all these aisles, look at all these choices. But a systems view reveals it as a place of extreme, rigid repetition. It is mostly just rearranged corn and soy masked by marketing. We are walking through a nutritional hall of mirrors.
So all those endless diet trends, the low carb, low fat, paleo, keto, they are really just surface ripples.
They are entirely surface-level fixes that operate strictly within the existing system. They don't challenge the underlying production model at all. Eating low carb but still eating industrial, factory farmed bacon doesn't fix the energy equation or the environmental impact. It's just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
So what is the actual structural clarity we need to take away from this?
True structural clarity is understanding that we are an active part of the energy cycle. Eating is fundamentally an ecological act. Every single time you lift a fork, you are connecting your biology to a massive system of soil, oil, and policy. The system is meticulously designed to blind us to that connection in order to keep the economic engine running smoothly. Seeing it, truly perceiving the architecture, is the first necessary step to dismantling the illusion. When you finally see the subsidized corn in the soda and the fossil fuel oil in the corn and the federal policy in the price tag, that is when you can actually start to make a real choice.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter, visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer link in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.